This is the 7th presentation of 13, so it's in the center. It's in the center of a line, which would be the fulcrum, but it's in the center of a double chirality, which makes it a complex pivot. We're looking at an illustration from the Gobi Desert, buried 1,000 years ago and dug up in 1900 by Sir R.L. Stein, who was the original archaeological pioneer of the Gobi Desert. And this was taken to England, and it is an illustration of the two founders of the I Ching, Fuxi and his lady Nugua. And you can see that they are double helix intertwined, and at the top there is a celestial matrix of the star system, and at the bottom there is a sun-like vehicle. Those two are poles of the celestial sphere, and they are the double helix of the bridge which man is in his civilized refinement. We have been looking at the way in which an era of genius blossomed on our planet about 5,000 years ago and led to an intensity of achievement in terms of civilizations that we find ourselves inheriting today, as the phrase goes, in spades. Our challenge, ostensibly, is how to develop, how to build, how to understand the architecture of a new civilization, a civilization that is star system wide. The ostensible difficulty, no matter how difficult that is impeded by an undertone that civilization can only occur if there is a preparation like a liquid beginning called a planetary culture. A culture precedes a civilization because a culture is the way in which the flow of experience is at home in the field of nature. A civilization has a field of differential consciousness, and its flow is history. It becomes a difficulty in cultures when there's a different culture impinging upon your culture, and this in a way is a culture shock. And the fragility of cultures very early on usually are mitigated because there is a way for cultures to have an exchange among themselves in terms of sharing the rituals and of coming through experience with a modicum of shared experience, so that the feelings are at least recognizable of the different cultures, and that the images become compound in a way that they can be at least shared, at least some of the major ones, between them. And this leads to a larger, more comprehensive symbol system. And that symbol system is the seal of the integral of that whole cycle of nature, of the rituals and the existential things, of the flow of experience and images and feeling tones, and put into a sealed cycle so that the four-dimensional world, from nature to the symbolic thought that ties this together in an integral is then of a whole, and it can lead to several cultures, sometimes later many cultures, sharing comparatively. But a civilization is a deep transform of every phase of that cycle, and especially of developing 4 other dimensions that have almost never been recognized as dimensions. The first dimension of consciousness we call vision, Michio Kaku, we're going to talk a little bit about today, has done a book, How Science Will Revolutionize the 21st Century. It's entitled Visions. And it has here a rectangle as a special kind of a matrix. Kaku is famous for his introductions to superstrings, which we will talk about today a little bit. But what's important for us is to come back and understand that 3000 BC was a watershed, and just 5 exemplars from that time period will serve to remind us how epical it was. In China, it was the beginnings of what became the I Ching. It was the development of the trigrams. And we'll come back to it in just a moment. At the same time, in India, there was the development that led to the first great civilization in India, not the Aryan civilization of the Vedas, but almost 1,000 years, 1,500 years before that, the development of the Indus civilization, sometimes called the Harappan civilization, because the largest city, the most northern city of that whole civilization was called Harappa. It was on one of the rivers that is a branch that all of them eventually, all the great rivers come together as the Indus, and is a major river, and some 400 miles south of Harappa was an equally large city, Mohenjo-Daro. They had several 100,000 people by 2600 BC, by the time the pyramids in Egypt were built. They had baked clay sewer systems and parallel and perpendicular roads and agricultural facilities that went out hundreds of miles from each of the cities through the Indus River Valley, and they were quite capable human beings. They were not white human beings. They were dark Dravidian individuals. And one finds the same kind of qualities in early Indus civilization that you recognize that come primordially out of Africa and African civilizations, and the Australian Aborigines in their original refined spiritual civilization. In India, the great watershed was the Mahabharata, the Great Indian War, about 3100 BC, and it settled the way in which there would be a Indus civilization. The writing down of the Mahabharata only came around 300 BC. It was never written down before, and I showed last week one of the great translations into English of the Mahabharata. The man, the sage who wrote it down, was named Vyasa, and you can date the Bhagavad Gita, which is part 6 out of 18. They're called Parvans, and it is the date of the way in which written symbolic language then made the Mahabharata available for a new level of civilization in India. about 300 BC. Contemporaneous with Fuxi in China and the Mahabharata in India, one finds in Central Asia the development of a complex, wise man society, and a society is the phase of symbols in between a culture and a civilization, that once the symbol structure of a society is perfected so that it is a permeable membrane, the culture in interfacing with other cultures can permeate through that membrane and create a civilization. So that a civilization is literally based upon the osmosis of multiculturals into the beginnings of a civilization. That a civilization is not a mythic flow, but is a historic flow. And that a civilization flows in the field of consciousness and must be able to reach back through the symbol system so that the flow of experience can find a way to no longer just be cultural, even on an intercultural complexity, but is able to transform and become a historical civilization. One of the difficulties for our time is that the early understanding of how this works, how history works, vis-a-vis myth, was largely a discovery in the German language. When the German language was translated into English in the early part of the 20th century, certain terms were mistranslated. One of the peculiar ways in which this happened, just to give you an indication, is the development of what was eventually to be called calculus. The translation of the German word Abbildung became used both for representation and for transformation. Not being understood that a transformation is a differential conscious language term, and representation is an integral, natural, referential term. They are radically different. You cannot use the same term. This is simply an indication of the kind of snag that gets into the way and has gotten into the way of developing a planetary culture during the 20th century and developing a new civilization in the 21st century. The confusion comes from a closed mind that limits itself to an integral cycle and takes the dimensions of consciousness as being incorporated, absorbed into the ideas of the symbol structure. This is what they say in diplomatic language, a grave error, because it leads to self-sabotage. We're facing difficulties at the beginning of the 21st century that are unheralded because of several layers in a parfait, none of which can work. The first layer is that one has to deal with the situation in terms of history for the transforms, but one has to deal in terms of mythic horizon of experience in terms of the cultural matrix out of which it will be generated. neither of these aspects are happening. What occurs is that the closed mind, the closed symbol system, misunderstands that it has a window-like, membrane-like function, not only to preserve what is within the natural cycle, but to allow permeability of what is outside of that natural cycle. The best example of that is the cell. The cell is only possible because it has a membrane to keep all of the various functions within each cell. But each cell also has the ability to have a permeability of that cell, and these ionic channels, just to use one example, ionic channels of an atom of calcium or occasionally an atom of phosphorus, will make a transparency where material from without the cell can come within it and nourish it, and the cell's functions can reach out through that ionic channel and help direct how the traffic goes both ways. We are in a situation where none of the membranes are working. And it's peculiar, as we will see as we get into the higher echelons of our preparation, of the presentation making not only sense to you, but engendering a visionary amplitude. To make the point, we have to understand why science is in the ecology of consciousness and not in the cycle of nature originally. Because theories do not take place in the symbol structures, they take place in the field of consciousness. So that without a visionary field, one cannot have the beginnings of freedom to be able to creatively imagine and to put into application the function of remembering. The function of remembering is extremely important because the way in which imagination, image making, the image base as a set, as a platform, is originally in the natural cycle. It's generated in the mythic horizon of experience and put together in the symbolic structure of what we call thought. The memory in thought only occurs as there is a different dimension that comes into play, and the ancient way of doing it was that the thumb allows you to grasp what before you could only touch, and now because you can grasp it, you can use it as a tool to develop new aspects of experience. It is this flexibility of a fifth dimension, of that visionary quality, that early on in our kind, our species, set us apart from all of the species before us. All of the different species, not only of Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthal, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, but onto the generations of millions of years of higher primates that were no longer apes, but had become, like Australopithecines, had become the transition to, literally the membrane to, the great family of Homo species. The way in which symbols become transparent is that they become a written language. So that a civilization depends upon the permeability of writing to be able to take the referential signs of spoken language put in with syllabic signs, and to have those signs, the phonetic and the referential, constitute then a set of symbols that can be read by the visionary, creative imagination. And to remember that one is literally reading through the letters. It isn't just simply that there are shapes of ink on a white background. They together constitute the keys by which the music is heard and seen in consciousness. So that when you teach little children how to read, or you teach illiterate adults how to read, you encourage them to make pictures while they read, that the words translate into this, and that one of the ways which helps them is that you read from the print to them so that they hear it. If you read stories that are printed to children so that they can hear it first, they become acquainted with the fact that these are transparent symbols, and that then one can learn to read through them. And the way that one learns to read through them is that they learn to read out loud through them. But the beginning of learning to read out loud through them is not in a prose mode, but in a song mode. They sing songs together. And so in kindergartens, you give them little clackers and little bells, and they sing songs together and are shown that you can write those songs down so that you can learn. But in order to learn, you have to put your mnemonic into a calibration, which is called learning your ABCs, learning your numbers. And that if you can learn to count, and you can learn your alphabet, and how does one learn an alphabet? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There is a chanting, poetic rhythm that harkens back to the flow in which a myth storyteller would tell, but instead of telling a myth, one is telling the symbolic matrix which one is going to use to see through. So that the memory is taken from the remembering field of vision and put into the mind as part of the formal structure of thought. One now has a memory. One takes the formal structure of image intergaling, which is the imagination, and makes an exchange with remembering that becomes the memory. The imagination becomes creative remembering. It's no longer just the images that you have in that structure in the symbolic thought, but it is a function within the field of vision. And one of the miracles is that it distributes itself co-dimensionally with remembering. And when this happens, one's remembering now becomes creatively imaginative, and out of this comes the forms, the prismatic forms of art. The architecture of the person is not the culture. The architecture of the person is the culture that has been already transformed into a field of vision that is able to create in a memorable way a new level of what before was an individual in symbolic thought, I am I, what was the character of one's experiencing. You can tell even in animals their character, even little puppies, little children. They exemplify a character almost immediately. And The basis for that comes from the existential, from the ritual base that are all generated out of the field of nature. Our problems are all interrelated because of a closed mentality that only seeks to have consciousness be a sub-function of the symbolic system of thought. This is called the tyranny of doctrine, the imprisonment by codes, the making of what would be an extraordinary insight illuminating the field of differential consciousness. Instead, it becomes a momentary flash that is subsumed and sequestered into a symbolic system. This is part of the difficulty, and it becomes compounded for us, especially over the last 5,000 years, because we have been moving not only towards higher powered civilizations, but moving towards a refinement of species. The last refinement of our Homo sapiens species was to Homo sapiens sapiens, repeated about 40,000 years ago. It took about 160,000 years of the Homo sapiens species to be able to come to that refinement, and the refinement was carried at that time by art. The development of sculpture and of painting and of an architecture. It isn't just a cave anymore. It is a cave that is arranged and tailored for a certain quality of aesthetic being in it and living in it and absorbing the sixth dimension of that art, of that aesthetic dimension, which forms out of the fifth dimension, the quintessential dimension of creative imagining and remembering in the field of differential consciousness. About 3000 BC, you had the development in China of what became eventually the I Ching. You had the developments in India of what eventually became the Vedic civilization, the Vedas. The Rig Veda was the first Veda initially written down about 1000 BC. It took about 2,000 years from the original insight of a new civilization to be able to come to a more refined civilization at that time. Vedic India is a vast refinement of the early 3000 BC India, just as in China, from 3000 BC to about 1000 BC, you had the development of the trigrams into the hexagrams in the beginnings of the Zhou dynasty, so that the Chinese name for the I Ching is actually the Zhou-yi. It is the symbols of the Zhou people put into a new order, a new arrangement. And the saying in Chinese civilization is that the original I Ching is on the heavenly pattern. The refinement of the I Ching 2,000 years later is that the heavenly pattern has given an insight to the human pattern. And because the heavenly pattern originally was linked mysteriously to the earth, now when man is the bridge between heaven and earth, man's qualities are a part of a triumvirate where heaven, man, and earth work together now as a triad. One can even use the term Trinity. we can even use the term as a triangle. They make a very stable new kind of form. That form refines itself about 500 years later in both India and China in this pair of exemplars. In China, the Zhou-yi refines itself to the Tao Te Ching about 500 years later. In India, the Vedic civilization refines itself to the historical Buddha. Whereas you would never have had a Buddha emerge out of cultures, no matter how complex. Emerged out of a deeper transform of a previous civilization. The same in China, you would never have had the genius of Lao Tzu, which at the same time, about 500 BC, was the genius of Confucius as well. Confucius emphasizing Zhen as the human-hearted sharing of man with the primordial pair, Tao and Te, whereas Lao Tzu emphasized the Tao and the Te in a new kind of relationality where the Te itself was a pair. Not only was there an original pair, Tao and Te, but Te itself, not in imitation of the original pairing, but in an expansion of the original pairing, so that Te, 500 BC, became yin and yang. So that by the time of Lao Tzu, you had Tao, yin, and yang as Te. And it took another 150 years for a Chinese genius named Tzu Yan to make the yin-yang school, to make it refined enough that then it could be taught as a school. And the Qia in Chinese, a school, that yin-yang Qia became the foundation of the way in which dynastic China that had existed for 2,000 years before it was able to be transformed into a new civilization. And the first founder of that new civilization, one of his most prominent names was Chen. And so everyone became not only of this tribe, that tribe, or of the previous dynasties, but now everyone became his, Chinese, Chinese. At the very same time that you have Lao Tzu and the historical Buddha, in the Egyptian Greek world you have Pythagoras. So that you have this very powerful triumvirate. And added to them, you have a resuscitation of someone who had lived about 1,700 years before, Zarathustra, brought back into play by Cyrus the Great and his son Darius and their sons. The Achaemenid dynasty became a flashpoint where Zarathustra was brought in at the same time as Pythagoras, same time as the historical Buddha, same time as Lao Tzu and Confucius. And a sixth figure can be added to this because at the time that the Achaemenid dynasty was coming into play with Cyrus the great Jewish sage in exile in Babylon, which Cyrus the Great took over the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the great Jewish prophet at the time was Ezekiel. So when it comes to understanding that there are creative, memorable waves where especially not cultures, but civilizations come into formation in a more refined way. You had in the same generation Confucius, Lao Tzu, Pythagoras, Ezekiel, the historical Buddha, the revival of Zarathustra in a completely new, powerful way, So that 500 BC becomes like a watershed. It becomes one of those indicators that the great German philosopher in the 20th century, one of the greatest, was Karl Jaspers. He said these are axial periods in the development of humankind. They are axial because almost everything that comes before them has not just been integrated in them, but has been swirled into them in such a way that it becomes memorable on a higher order and creative on a new range. And so it is a double pivot axiality, whereas the original pivot, the pivot that traditionally was there in civilizations, is summed up in the ancient Chinese phrase, the pivot of the four quarters. The pivot of the four quarters is the center of the square. And when it has its pivot, the square becomes a circle, and the pivot becomes the center of the circle. But when there is a deeper refinement and transform, the square becomes a cube, and the circle becomes a sphere. Now you have a complexity that extends to all four dimensions, plus a fifth quintessential dimension of insightful understanding of consciousness. But the difficulty at the beginning, it's one of the hexagrams of the I Ching, difficulty at the beginning. There are very few people initially who can understand that this was not just an idea in the symbolic structure. It was an exploration in the field of differential consciousness. That the field of consciousness is no longer integral, but differential. It complements, like in a complementarity, but it does not do its refining as just making revisions. It isn't just a revised representation. It is in fact an original presentation, and that original presentation transforms. And it transforms in a double way. The field of consciousness transforms the field of nature itself in a very spectacular way. And it transforms the mind because it allows for the interchange of what were centers before into a shared double pivot. So that a creative imagination now is not only based on the imagination, but is able to bring the transformed imagery, the transformed feelings into a greater refinement. And that in consciousness then, the qualities that have been integrated together become a function of higher remembering. The four dimensions of the integral cycle are complemented by four dimensions of the ecology of consciousness. But when they come together, they have a 9-dimensional complementarity, which itself generates a 10th generation. That form of the 10-dimensional is what we call reality. It generates what Michio Kaku called hyperspace, a scientific odyssey through parallel universes, time warps, and the 10th dimension. It is the ability, as one of the great sages of the 20th century has put it, Roger Penrose, in 1,000 pages, what will be his magnum opus is The Road to Reality. It is the ability to be real that requires a 10-dimensional extension of the four-dimensional world. The sticking point is that those who remain only integral think of the four dimensions as being the basis of proof, evidence, and the other six dimensions as being internal dimensions of the mind. This is attributing to the sponge the origin of the water that it has soaked up. It is an obvious error when put into that light, but the mind itself, as long as it has abstracted itself out and has become purely integral, is incapable of recognizing this because it is completely taken up with cognizing. Remembering is based on recognition, not on cognition. It isn't based on representation, but on transformation. And without appreciating the tremendous art that there is in developing beyond the prism into the spectrums that come out of the prism, which are kaleidoscopic, one does not have the complex flow out of which an analysis can come, out of which the forms of analytics can become actual. As the beginnings of Homo sapiens sapiens were in art, the beginnings of Homo sapiens stellaris are in science. The arts are absolutely essential because they give us the initial resonance of what the harmonic is going to be like. Not only can you sing, but you can compose. You can not only have the chants of an intertribal dance, you can have the Christmas oratorio. And one can learn that that art has a science that goes with it as well. We're going to take a little break. Let's come back immediately to an interesting diagram. There are 4 dots here arranged in a square. And when they free fall, they recalibrate and reconfigure into a diamond. It's an illustration in a volume, a classic volume on superstrings, published about 20 years ago by Cambridge University Press. The caption reads, 4 particles arranged in a square fall freely. Differential gravitational forces gradually distort the square to a diamond shape. The bottom particle is nearer the Earth, so feels a slightly stronger gravity and falls more rapidly. The top particle lags behind all the others as it is furthest from the Earth. The outside pair falls slowly together as explained in Figure 1. In the 42 years that it took to put together the learning civilization, which is a pattern of recalibration, to bring about a planetary culture and a star system civilization and a refinement of our species, the natural cycle has a square as a frame of referentiality naturally. I have called it for the last 30 years the square of attention. It's the frame of the picture. The picture is the world, which can be selected out in representational images, can be put together as an exemplar of the whole, and all of it is framed completely by an integral symbolic structure of thought. When that is put into the quintessential transform of a fifth dimension of consciousness, a whole new ecology develops out of that. The four dimensions of differential consciousness, which do not form a cycle, they generate an ecology, so that the fifth dimension of consciousness is no longer just in the ecology, but cycles itself to a higher order, a nine-dimensional complementarity of nature and consciousness together. That nine-dimensional complementarity instantly generates a 10-dimensional form, which we would call reality. Roger Penrose's last book, 1,000 pages, The Road to Reality. Michio Kaku's great book from 1994, Hyperspace, A Scientific Odyssey Through Parallel Universes, Time Warps, and the 10th Dimension. That 10 dimensions now have done something which initially in the 1980s, when it was first mooted, was very difficult to appreciate. Kaku says the mathematics of the different aspects of physics by the 1980s was well understood. They were confirmable, but they were disparate. For instance, there was no way that the quantum world and the world of Einstein's relativity fit together very well. There were many disparate pieces, but when you got to a 10-dimensional mathematic, all the different pieces fit together like puzzles, and it came out. But it came out in such a way that it was no longer imageable. It had to be intuited on several orders of consciousness above vision. The only way to get to that several orders above vision is through history. Without the seven-dimensional complex flow of history, one cannot get there because there's no there. A prismatic differentiality does not proceed along a path. There's no path integral. What was trustworthy before and works before and always will work before is that the cycle of four dimensions in nature will have a path integral that one can learn not only how to synthesize all of it together, but one can come to the unity of the integral and know it. One can understand it. One of the deepest insights into this was in 1859 by a mathematician named Riemann, Bernard Riemann. And Riemann is one of the world's great mathematicians. This is a 1926 book on Riemannian geometry published by Princeton at a time when this was of extraordinary value, because it was the time where the quantum theory was visionarily expressed well enough by then to be understood to be catastrophic to the old classical physics and mathematics, but distinctly different from Einstein's enormous success in relativity. One of the great mathematicians of that day was David Hilbert. And this is a little blurb that I cut out one time. Headline, Can Mathematicians Prove the Riemann Hypothesis? In the early 1900s, German mathematician David Hilbert said that if he awakened after 1,000 years of sleep, the first question he'd ask would be, has the Riemann hypothesis been proven? Hilbert was one of the world's greatest mathematicians and held forth at the Mecca of mathematics, Göttingen University, where people later, like our wonderful geniuses who made the atomic bomb, went to mathematical school, Oppenheimer. It's only been 100 years, but the answer so far is no. This is the beginning of the 21st century. No one. Put forward by Bernhard Riemann in 1859, the hypothesis would establish the distribution of zeros on something called the Riemann zeta function. That in turn correlates to the intervals between prime numbers. Prime numbers, numbers that can be divided only by 1 and themselves, 2, 3, 5, etc., are the building blocks of mathematics. Because all other numbers can be arrived at by multiplying them together. 150 equals 2 times 3 times 5 times 5. Understanding the primes sheds light on the entire landscape of numbers. And there's great mysteries that go with this. But out of making sense out of this, the essential visionary difficulty is to imagine, at first theoretically, that is creatively imagining and then remembering what you see, how you see. How do zeros distribute themselves on a mathematical membrane, the Riemann zeta function, so that when numbers come out, they are distinct and have between them intervals that are the distributed zeros? Here's the solution. For this, we go back to ancient China because we're starting with ancient China today. 5,000 years ago, the insight in China, like it was there in ancient Egypt at the same time, it was there in the ancient Mesopotamia at the same time, an existential phenomenon emerges whole, and while it may have its maturation at any given slice in its occurrence, it will be a unity, it will be a whole. A baby is born whole. It isn't that the hands come out and then after a while the feet come out, the baby comes out. The ancient word for this is that it has the power to be, and in Chinese, that word is te. Te. It's not only there, it is there unified. It is there in its oneness. What is also there, but not there, is the Tao, a zero. That zero is invisibly participatory in the te, but in such a way that it allows the te to be itself, and that one of the te, because it is in a relationality, a ratioability to the zero of the Tao, Though one can't count the 0, one understands that the 1 can be a 1 over 2, it can be a half, so that the te can be paired. It can be split into halves, each one being 1/2 of the 1. That first half of the te is yin. That second 1/2 of the te is the yang. Now you have a development of expression where the yin and yang are together the unity of the te, but they are now distinct from each other in the sense that they are polarized. So that the polarity of yin and yang is the apparent wholeness, but there is an unapparent and yet mystically discernible triad, because the yin and the yang also have a participation of the Tao. So that when it comes to expressing it in terms of an integral symbol, the genius of Fuxi and Nugua 5,000 years ago was to express it as an unbroken line for the te and a broken line for the yin-yang of the te that has the Tao in it, and that in order to make it symbolically apparent, you not only have the two lines, but you add a third line in its range, in its ecology of consciousness. So that the yin line, broken, the yang line, unbroken, are paired with a third line that can either be broken or unbroken, as long as you put the entirety of the ecology into a symbolic structure that includes in that matrix all of the possibilities, all of the probabilities. It turns out that with a polarity, there are 8 possibilities of those 3 lines occurring. And the movement of the third line will also have a pair of columns of 4 each. One will be the column of the way in which the third line behaves in a yang mode, the other the way a yin line behaves in the way of a yin mode, and culminating both will be the excerpting, the abstracting of the movable third line into a form that symbolically expresses all 3 of the possibilities. There will be 3 yang lines, 3 yin lines, being the culmination in the entirety of that will be the matrix that now is able to have an application transformably through a quintessential consciousness to the entire cycle of nature. And so the early way to express this was to describe the trigrams as a matrix of being a cycle of nature which is discernible mystically by the field of consciousness. And that one would have as a symbol of this matrix not just the 8 trigrams arranged in a kind of a circle, in a kind of a cycle, but one would have a central symbol expressing this, the Chinese Tai Chi symbol. That the polarities, black for yang, white for yin, have exchangeable centers. The black has a circle of white at its center, generative center, and the white has a circle of black at its generative center. These are not just circles, but they are, in terms of the topology of string theory, these are disks. And a disk is one of the 3 forms that one can discern in the differential geometry that leads to a 10-dimensional understanding. One of the other forms is a sphere, along with the disk, along with the extension of the plane of the disk into a projected plane. And as long as one keeps track consciously of the differential geometry that's being developed, the mathematics in 10 dimensions will come to be expressively real, in that one can test it out in the integral of nature, and one can prove it out in the analytic of consciousness. So that now one has an experimental physics and a theoretical physics that form a complementarity if one keeps a parity between them, where the one doesn't outstrip the other, but that the parity of the pairedness of it is able to be at the same time lifted to higher orders, and that one says, as an exemplar, that the initial complementarity in parity of the two is a symmetry, and that when raised to a higher order, it is a supersymmetry. And that by going to a 10-dimensional transformational reality, all of the developments that we have come to respect in terms of experiment and theory interface with each other in such a way that not only is it whole, it is also infinite. And in mathematics, infinity functions like a zero. In any equation, which is the parity, it is the parity expressed in a conscious language, symbolic system of mathematics, but applies to the existentiality and referentiality of the natural cycle. And what is in the Chinese carried all the time is that the Tao is distributed in such a way that it allows for each Te to be individually the quanta that it is, no matter where it is in the disk from the sphere on the projected plane. And that one can understand then one of the peculiarities of planetary history, pointed out for the first time in the 1950s at Cambridge University in England by Joseph Needham, who was the head man of Caius College. Caius is spelled C-I-U-S, Caius. Caius College is the place where mathematics has had its greatest development. Sir Isaac Newton had a chair, the Lucasian chair. Stephen Hawking holds that Lucasian chair today. But Joseph Needham was the first in his Science and Civilization in China series of volumes. It runs now to 20 volumes, almost 1,000 pages each, published by Cambridge University Press, that the Chinese were the first to develop calculus in Taoist monasteries in the 800s, but they used it as spiritual training, not as an application in terms of science. And that when one went back into this use of that application, it came out in the late Tang because of the development at the time of Zen. And that one of the mystical applications of it at the time, 1,200 years ago, was that the transformation of the physical existentiality of a human being could be preserved exactly in the unity at the moment of death, so that one would have a multi-dimensional application of the entire ecology of consciousness and the entire cycle of the dimensions of space-time, and one would come to a cinching of that in terms of the actuality, and that the first human being to be able to do this was Huineng, the sixth patriarch of Zen Buddhism. And in one of the early volumes of Science and Civilization in China, the cigar-smoking young Joseph Needham went to the monastery where Huineng was still seated in his final moment of meditation at the moment of death, and petrified his body so that it was dark black like anthracite coal, and it was perfectly petrified at that moment. And Joseph Needham took a photo of that and put it in one of the early volumes of Science and Civilization in China. At any given point, one can have the dimensionality of it sealed, as it were, so that the te of that point of existence has incorporated the zero, infinity of the Tao, also into that moment. It's like a music tone will not only have the tone, it will have an overtone aspect to it, which allows for it to be a part of a resonant set, a harmonic. It will also have an undertone, which is the ability to take parts of that note where you can have a half note or quarter note, as well as a couple of notes sounded together, as well as a whole octave sounded together as a chord. That nothing interferes with the existential integral of a note by playing it as a part of a chord or by taking it as a fraction of itself. The relationalities in the music will hold. They will play. Instruments will be able to convey it. The human voice will be able to sing it. What faces us is the daunting recognition scalar that allows for us to move from such an exemplar in the imaginative visioning of a poetic presentation language to be able to see that it is expansionable to a star system civilization on the interstellar frontier and a refinement of species for the first time in 40,000 years. And that they're concomitants, but that they are concomitants only in terms of being able to learn to step up to a 10-dimensional minimal reality. That it takes a while. This two-volume set on string theory came out in 1998. Joseph Polensky and Joe signed my copy with a kind of a flourish that sometimes Czech, especially Czech Americans, have this ostentatious, wonderful, cavalier way of being joyful. My God, we sold this. Thanks from us. The foreword to Volume 1 is a couple of paragraphs by Stephen Weinberg, the great mathematical genius and physicist at the University of Texas in Austin. His big 3-volume on quantum mathematics published by Princeton. From the beginning, writes Weinberg, it was clear that despite the successes, the standard model of elementary particles would have to be embedded in a broader theory that would incorporate gravitation as well as the strong and electroweak interactions. There is at present only one plausible candidate for such a theory. It is the theory of strings, which started in the 1960s as a not very successful model of hadrons. Hadrons are atomic nucleus particles like the proton or the neutron. It's a structure of quarks that are in a triad. That's why a proton is so stable that proton decay has not been detected in the universe yet, after almost 15 billion years. The theory of strings started in the 1960s as a not very successful model of hadrons and only later emerged as a possible theory of all forces. There is no one better equipped to introduce the reader to string theory than Joseph Polchinski. This is in part because he has played a significant role in the development of the theory. To mention just one recent example, he discovered the possibility of a new sort of extended object, the directlet brane, B-R-A-N-E, which has been an essential ingredient in the exciting progress of the last few years in uncovering the relation between what had been thought to be different string theories. And he goes on from there. There was a wonderful article in the Los Angeles Times by the great Casey Cole. She did this article in 2003. Theory alters physics, big picture, brain worlds. One of the little short paragraphs. To date, the only theory that comes close to marrying the two is string theory, a mathematically elegant set of ideas that has swept the world of physics over the last few decades. According to string theory, the basic ingredients of the universe are not point-like particles, but tiny strings vibrating in 10-dimensional space. Although still untested, string theory has theoretical successes, earning it an ever-widening circle of admirers. One of the pursuing ways to test out, are we imagining something fictitious that is an artifact of our inability to handle the symbolic mathematics, to write that language right? One of the earliest ways was the COBE map of the energy left over from the initial Big Bang 14.7 billion years ago, at a point where 379,000 years after the Big Bang, the plasma originally there had integrated to such an extent that the first pressure of radiation was being released that allowed for a space to occur so that there could be elements like hydrogen that formed and formed in such a way that they could continue to form, and then in that implosive integral became stars, and the star-stellar wind began to blow the gas in the plasma far enough away that the stars shined for the first time. Let there be light. The map that NASA put out, also with a little bit of holographic tilting, becomes the follow-up to it, the WMAP, which was years later, and it was much more refined and showed that indeed there were not only the distribution equally of the energy from the Big Bang, but that there were minuscule ripples in it, not ripples like pebble in a pond ripples. The signal from our galaxy has been removed from this map of the entire cosmos so that there's no interfering skewing. The WMAP detects much finer features than are visible in the COBE maps of the sky. Hot regions are shown in red and are 4/10,000ths of a Kelvin degree hotter than the cold regions, shown in blue and purple. The minuscule difference is due literally to the actuality that even fractions of 10,000ths of a degree of heat are existentially unified. They exist. For such to exist, there must be a space, an interval in between 4 10,000ths of a Kelvin and 3 10,000ths of a Kelvin. Or, to put it more melodramatically, there must be a precise existential difference between 0.0004 degrees of a Kelvin and 0.000399999 degrees of Kelvin, that the T of whatever occurs existentially is guaranteed because it has a zero that insulates its unity, but that the zero is a permeable membrane. It's permanent and permeable at the same time. That zeros are interfaces, like infinities are interfaces, of the osmotic ecology that is guaranteed by consciousness. That the integral of nature is real in terms of its quantification. One can be specific to any degree of accuracy that you wish. The discovery of a new prime number, was just a couple of weeks ago, and it runs to enough digits to fill a whole paragraph. But it is distinctly a prime number, can only be divided by 1, T, or itself, which is T in that form, in that calibration. But are ratioable to any other numbers because the zeros and the infinities are membrane permeable. And our new star system civilization is based on our ability to carry our zero distribution naturally in a planetary culture and to let it expand in freedom, because it takes each new dimension requires greater freedom. So that our species, Homo sapiens stellaris, can only have mobility in an infinite freedom, 10-dimensional reality. So that the guaranteeing of those dimensions of freedom between all of us is the necessary recipe. Otherwise, it's not going to be real. It will not work. Not only will it not work, it will not even be imaginable. It will not be theoretically, creatively imaginable, and there will be no remembering of it until it actually occurs. Then the recognition will come into play. Long ago, Plato, about 387 BC, founded the first academy in the world in Athens. In order to do so, he was advised by the greatest Pythagorean of the day in southern Italy, in Tarentum, who had saved Plato's life. Plato was under penalty of being killed by one of the mean tyrants in Syracuse, Sicily. Dion was his name, son of Dion, another tyrant. And Archelaus got Plato released to him in Tarentum in southern Italy, where the heel of the boot of Italy would be. And he said, you must go like Pythagoras, who founded our community of understanding and wisdom. You must go to Egypt and you must study there. And when you have studied long enough that you are able to participate in the whole harmonic spectrum, which you will be conscious of, then you form a school. It took him 20 years. And when the Academy was founded, it was founded on the ability to talk with another human being in such a way that the parity of your existential individuality and your mythic horizon of character and the assiduous specificality of your equality were carried together exactly at the same moment of conscious transform. And if that were so, the proof would be that your spiritual persons would be companions permanently. You would recognize yourself in the other. I call it shared presence. More next week.